So I'm going to introduce you to me by showing you a little video that will get us into our topic today.
I've always struggled to understand God. As a child, I remember sitting on a shrunken plastic chair with my hand in the air and my toes hovering above the floor. Who made God, miss? Is God bigger than the universe? Why does God tell Abraham to kill his son? Will he tell me to hit my mate? If I do hit my mate, then isn't it really God's fault because he's in charge of the universe? Paradoxes, mysteries, conundrums, the Christian faith is full of them. My Sunday school teacher always had an answer. If we could understand God, then we would be God. God works in mysterious ways. Don't be awkward, get on with your colouring. One of the paradoxes of faith is that years of living the Christian life and studying the Bible do not give us immunity from those bothersome questions. The more I know I don't know. So I still struggle with those same questions I had when I was 6 years old. Where is God? What is he really like? Does God really care? Sometimes I sit in a study surrounded by books, or in a church service surrounded by worshippers, or in a hospital surrounded by tragedy, and those questions still bother me. My Sunday school teacher's easy answers are no help at all. I need more than an easy answer, a handy proof text or a trivial distraction. Our Bible heroes didn't archive their difficult questions or sweep them under the carpet. Moses asked, "Where is God?" David demanded, "Why God?" Habakkuk complained, "Really God?" Job debated, "Does God really care?" Paradoxes, mysteries, conundrums, all dared to be brought out into the open to God himself. So what I want to ask is, what if we've been going about this all wrong? What if we've settled for neatly packaged, simplistic answers instead of seeking out the deep and rich realities of our faith? What if it is actually in the difficult parts of the Bible that God is most clearly revealed? What if it is in and through our struggles and doubts that we learn the meaning of a true relationship with God? What if this ancient faith we call Christianity has survived so long, not in spite of, but precisely because of its apparent contradictions? What if Christianity was never meant to be simple?
Let's get into our topic of the paradox of suffering. Suffering is probably the question that I get asked when people are thinking about faith. How can a good God allow so much suffering to take place in our world? And you need to know that this is not a theoretical question for most people. They're not just asking it because they're interested in theology, although they probably secretly are. They're asking it because they've had some kind of life event that's changed them and changed their perception of God. And for us as a family, this is a really pressing question. We've been adoptive parents and foster parents for the last 10 years. And because of the work that we do, we are seeing kids that have had terrible things done to them. And they're not at arm's length, they're around our table each morning. We know stories of violence and sexual abuse. And you think, why has this been allowed to happen? This is not right. And I'm answering, I guess, as a theologian, but also as an activist. I want to see a different world. I don't just want to give you an answer. I want to call you to action. And so again, for Christians, this can't just be an academic discipline, although we sometimes make it that. Let me give you a quick, snappy answer to a difficult problem. But actually, we are called to do something about it. So that's where we'll go. You also need to know that the problem of suffering is not just a problem for Christians. Everybody has a problem with suffering. No one quite knows how to resolve it. And there are different ways that people try. Let me give you one from a famous atheist. You might have heard him. His name is Richard Dawkins. Here is how he answers the problem of suffering. If the universe were just electrons and selfish genes, meaningless tragedies are exactly what we should expect, along with equally meaningless good fortune. Such a universe would be neither evil nor good in intention. In a universe of blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt and other people are going to get lucky. And you won't find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is, at bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. I've quoted Dawkins at length there because I want you to hear this isn't just a soundbite. This isn't just me ripping a sentence out of context. Dawkins' answers to the problem of suffering is tough luck. Bad things happen. Some people get hurt, some people don't. Deal with it. And to be honest, there's something of an integrity there. That he's recognizing that the universe doesn't have a meaning, it doesn't have a purpose. This is what philosophers like Friedrich Nietzsche would say was nihilism. Ultimately, there is no reason for anything, and stop living as if there is. The problem is, this is a really difficult philosophy to live by. Most people don't live as if this is true. Even Richard Dawkins doesn't live as if this is true. He has a purpose in life. He has a mission that he's on. He is trying to persuade the world. He's trying to make the world a better place by getting rid of something evil that he considers Christianity. That's interesting because he doesn't even believe in evil. And yet he would entitle a book, Root of All Evil, won't he? Which is talking about Christianity. So there's a problem with this. It's also not the way that most people respond when they suffer. When most people suffer, they ask a question. And the question is, why? But the question why betrays a belief that the universe shouldn't be this way. There was a couple in our church actually they were in our neighbourhood. They weren't part of our church when we lived in Harrow. And they had a beautiful little toddler son. And he was part of our mums and toddlers group. And he was just the life and soul of the party, massive big brown eyes and a huge smile. And he went in for what they thought was a routine operation at our local hospital. And there was something that went wrong, so that his brain was without oxygen for a very long time. And when he came out of the operation, he was in some kind of vegetative state, and we weren't quite sure how much of his faculties he would recover, if any. And so I went to visit the family because I got to know them over coffee during the mums and toddlers group. That's a great time to turn up and chat and get to know people locally. And so I'd got to know this family. And I just went to visit them. And I'd love to tell you that I had the perfect answer to the problem that they were facing. I didn't. And most of the time I was listening and trying to grieve with the family. But they asked the question, why? Why has this happened? And they wouldn't have been happy with an answer that said, well, you know, when your brain is starved of oxygen, it tends to die, and then your faculties stop functioning in the same way. That isn't the why question. That's the how question. How has this happened? And then you could get into legalities around whether there was negligence or not. But that wasn't what they were asking. Why has this been allowed to happen? There's someone in control that has not done their job. And so a bad thing has happened. I don't understand that, they say. So even the problem of suffering is an indicator that we believe that the universe ought to be different than it is. It's an indicator that maybe someone's in control. Even if we don't agree with the way that he's ruling the universe, the fact that we're asking why betrays something of our belief in him. Another way people try to resolve this is in Buddhism. And if you are a Buddhist and I've got your view wrong, I'm very happy to be corrected. But Buddhism works on the principle that suffering comes because there is a gap between how you want the universe to be and how the universe actually is. And so what you need to do in order to kind of come to some kind of resolution with that is get rid of your expectation. Kill your desire. Because if you don't have desire, then you won't be wanting. And you can kind of live with the universe as it is. That's a really difficult philosophy to live by too, isn't it? It's basically saying, yes, there is suffering, but if you can just orientate yourself differently, then you won't expect there not to be. That's a really tough one to live with, and I'm not sure it satisfies some of our intellectual and, I suppose, existential longings. Here's another way that some people try to resolve it. I grew up in a Hindu family. My name is Krishna. I call myself Krish, so I don't have to have that conversation with every Christian. So, it just gets me out of a lot of interesting dilemmas. So in my family, and again, Hinduism is a broad ship, as it were. It holds a multitude of different values. But in my family, the way they resolve this is by saying, well, the stuff that happens to you in this life is punishment for bad stuff that you've done in a previous life. And that's why bad things happen. And that leads to all sorts of very difficult philosophical and moral problems. The couple that I told you about in our church in Harrow, they got some pretty tough phone calls. They were from the Gujarat in India originally. And the phone calls they received were pretty damning. You must have been terrible people in a previous life that this tragedy has happened to you. Can you imagine the pain of trying to deal with that? You're dealing with a son you don't know whether he's blind, deaf and dumb, and you're being told it's your fault. And it's your fault for doing something you don't even remember. That's so difficult to live with. I'm not convinced that rings true with reality. You might remember a few years ago, we talked about it being an England match tonight. A certain England manager put forward a similar view. Glenn Hoddle said people with disabilities deserve it because they're being punished for previous sins. And that was not a politically sensitive or correct view. And it led to all sorts of problems. Interesting, at that time, my Hindu family and Hindu friends were very quiet because actually he was espousing pretty typical Hindu doctrine. So everyone has a problem. We could talk about other worldviews, but we just picked a few. Everyone has a problem with the problem of suffering, not just the Christian. But how do Christians begin to resolve it? And I guess I want to tell you a couple of things. One is the Bible doesn't neatly solve it for you. Okay, what we're going to do now is not actually contained in one nice little passage in the Bible. In fact, a lot of the time, God is saying, I'm not going to explain to you what's happening. Think of the story of Job. It's in my book, Paradoxology, the Job paradox. The God who is actively passive. He allows all of these terrible things to happen to Job and never explains why. It's a very difficult book because God isn't neat and sweet and easy to grasp. But let me give you some parameters that may begin to help, although not completely resolve. A classic way that people try to wrestle with this is talking about three impossible to resolve statements. The first is God is all loving. And that seems nice and easy to grasp. God is all loving. And if God is all loving, then he would have the will and the desire to end suffering. Okay, fine. God is all loving. Second thing is God is all powerful. And if God is all powerful, well, guess what? God wouldn't just have the will because he loves us. He'd actually have the power to end suffering. Okay, seems two fairly reasonable statements. Yeah, thanks. The third is that suffering occurs. So either God isn't all loving because he doesn't want to stop suffering and is content to see us suffer. Or God is all loving, but he's all kind of conflicted and he can't resolve the problem of suffering because he's not all powerful. Does that make sense? Do you see how those logical problems seem to fit together? It's kind of classic A-level RS. Okay, I'm going to give you a chance. How would you resolve that tension? Just have a little chat with your neighbour. How would you resolve the tension? You have a go first. And one answer is buying the book. I know, yeah. But how would you resolve that tension? What would you say? Okay, well, you could phone a friend. That's a good way to try and resolve it. Let's talk a little bit about these things. The first is you might begin to challenge the premise of these statements. Okay, so God is all powerful. Well, how powerful is God? Is God powerful enough to make a married bachelor or a square circle? Or here's a good one. Is God powerful enough to make a stone too heavy for himself to lift? Let's have a little vote. Hands up if you think God is powerful enough to make a stone too heavy for himself to lift. Okay, there's a problem now, because if God is powerful enough to make a stone too heavy for himself to lift, then there's something in the universe that he can't do, lift a stone. So is God still all powerful? Oh no, he's just kind of boxed himself into a logical problem. The problem is the concept of power. Okay, how many megawatts would it take to make a married bachelor a square circle, or a stone too heavy for yourself to lift? It's not a question of power, is it? So those are logically fallacious ideas. They're just little bits of language designed to trap you. They're not things in themselves. So no, God can't make a square circle. No, God can't make a married bachelor. And no, God can't make a stone too heavy for himself to lift, because they're not things. They're non-entities. So we might have misunderstood what we mean by power. The Bible says God cannot lie. Is that somehow an infringement on his power? It's not at all, is it? God can be all powerful and yet unable to lie, because he's completely pure morally. Are you with me? So we might want to challenge how some people think about all powerful. The second idea is God is loving. And they say, well, if God is loving, then he couldn't possibly allow suffering to take place. That's an interesting idea. Well, the classic way, and C.S. Lewis has been a favourite at the Books for Life Live event, hasn't he? Classic way people resolve this is by talking about the problem of suffering through the free will defence. And it's not a bad one. It's a good start. Because you could say, okay, I know we've got some students here from the local university. Good to see you. Give us a wave. Okay, don't be ashamed of your university. That's fine. And so you might come across a computer studies geek. Okay, it's cool to be a geek now, so that's all right. And that computer studies geek might be able to program a computer that, when the computer switches on, says to its owner, you are the most beautiful person. Thank you so much for programming me. It's a delight to serve you. That is possible to do, no doubt about it. But it might not be as meaningful as if I'd brought my 5-year-old foster son with me today. And if he'd come, and he probably would, he'd make a beeline to you, and he might say to you, would you be my friend? Now, which one is more meaningful to you? The computer or my son? I'm hoping it's my son. What's the difference? Well, the computer doesn't have choice. It's pre-programmed to do that already, isn't it? There's no element of free will. Well, my son, unless you found out later that I'd paid him to do it, he's not that way motivated, so it probably wouldn't work. But if my son is choosing to have a relationship with you, then that's very different. God is so loving that he wants a genuine relationship with us. And so it doesn't pre-program us to have to serve and love and worship God. He gives us freedom to choose whether we'll love him or disobey him. And if we disobey him, sadly, there are all sorts of negative consequences. It's a little bit like when you drop some dye in a fish tank. The dye doesn't just stay in a corner. It somehow affects everything in the fish tank. And so when human beings disobey God, that has a knock-on effect that everything is somehow tainted and broken. That's what Christians believe about the world, don't we? That the world now is not as God intended, that it's been damaged by human intervention. You can see that at least in the environmental crisis that we're facing. Did God will that? Well, not really. But who knew? Who knew that if I sprayed my armpits with lynx as a teenager, thinking that women would swim across oceans to come and be my friend, who knew that that would affect the ozone hole? You know, who'd made those connections? And so in the same way, we can see, look, the unintended consequences of human sin means everything is broken. And you can find out more about how to fix it at somewhere like the Tear Fund stand. And so we believe that a good and loving and yet all-powerful God has allowed suffering to enter the world because it was a consequence of human choice and freedom. That is not a kind of nice, neat, packaged answer that solves all of our existential problems about suffering. But it is a beginning, I guess, a clue, a way in to maybe think about it. But I said at the beginning that suffering and the problem of suffering is not just an intellectual problem. It's at the very heart of our faith. And Christians believe that God didn't just send an answer. He didn't just send a philosophical idea to the world to help them resolve suffering. No, God sent a person. Jesus came into the world and he suffered. If you look at the life of Christ, he suffered all sorts of things. Whether that was verbal abuse, whether it was social exclusion, whether that was being a refugee, whether that was being betrayed by his closest friends, whether it was physical pain of being nailed to a cross, or whether it was experiencing the anger of God at sin, Jesus experienced suffering. And so when we suffer, when we pray, there's someone we know that understands because he's been through it. You know, I've lost my mum about 5 years ago, and the people that can really understand that are people that have lost their parents too. There's an empathy there that isn't there for other people. Or there's an empathy with Christ because he suffered in every way that we have. And therefore we can speak to him about that in a way that we can almost speak to no one else. But Jesus didn't just suffer with us, he suffered for us. Christians believe that when Jesus died on the cross, it was to deal with sin. It was to deal with that dye in the fish tank that's affected everything. Suddenly, Jesus begins to undo all the bad that's gone wrong with the universe. Yes, he helps us to get a personal relationship with God, but he begins to fix human relationships. He begins to fix the environment. He begins to fix the way that we see our own selves. At the cross, Jesus is undoing the consequence of the sin in the garden. But I guess the other thing for me is the cross, which was followed by the resurrection, gives us hope. Hope that one day sin and evil and injustice and suffering won't have the final word. If Jesus had died on the cross, it would have been an incredible, if that is where it ended, it would have been an incredible act of love. But there's more. He rose from the dead. He defeated sin. His sacrifice for sin was acceptable. And so that means that fighting injustice and evil in this world is worth it. Because one day Jesus is going to put all things right. He's proved that by his resurrection. And that's what drives me in the work I'm doing for vulnerable kids. One day every child will get the love and care and attention that they need. One day there'll be no more domestic violence. One day there'll be no more sexual abuse. Because God's going to sort it all out when his kingdom comes on earth. And that means now I have hope to keep going. Now I get to give the world a taste of what's to come. And that's a tremendous privilege.